together. Pauline died a few years ago, and Rollerina used to crack me up. Always in the march, roller skates, a gown, a crown, and with a wand and bless you. And Rollerina, by day, was a Wall Street stockbroker. Wow. But gay pride, Rollerina was out there. Anyway, Jerry said to me, you make sure that no one cries at my memorial. I want it to be fun. So I'm going to try not to cry. I already cried. So Jerry was wonderful, an honorable, loving man, and I loved him. And he was always there to fight for our rights. And he was my friend. And I had to write it this way because I didn't want to cry, because I'm really trying not to. Jerry and I became really close in 2012. I moved to New York in the mid-70s, left, came back in 80s, left again in the 90s, lived in other countries, came back in the end of 2001 and have been doing surgery since then. So in 2012, at the drop-in room, which is a room here for seniors, and it's a SAGE room, we had a problem. It was going to close. And we had a big meeting with the center in SAGE, and I said, you know, this room has to be here into perpetuity, forever. And Jerry and I we strategized, and we became the leaders of the fight to keep the drop-in room. And we were both old activists. I was not out during Stonewall, I was dating men. And living in New Jersey, but in New Jersey, when I did come out in 72, I did first march in Philadelphia, which was in 72, and I was there. And then in 73, I came here, and Bette Midler entertained us, and it ended in Washington Square. Anyway, I was the New Jersey State Coordinator in 1979 for the first National March on Washington for gay rights. So last year, we've been fighting with the drop-in room and with SAGE and the center for 3 years. And so Jerry and I have been working on this, and the drop-in people here and out here. And I want to say, Jerry loved all of you. I mean, he would talk to me about you guys and women, and and his cancer support group, and Tom and Brian. You don't know how much somebody said he didn't say I love you. He told me he loved me, and he told me how much he respected and loved all of you, and his family also. So we've been fighting with the SAGE and the Center for 3 years, and that's where Jerry and I how we became close through our activism. So the center this year, we came to the drop-in, and all the furniture that we had was thrown out. This furniture had been donated by seniors. We also had things in there that were made by seniors. Some of them are deceased. So Jerry and I, of course, went berserk, and other people. And we planned all these things, demonstrations. Jerry said, Carol and I will be out there picketing. And we were lining up people actually to join us in the pickets. We had contacts with the press. We wrote letters. Phil Katz wrote a wonderful letter with all our demands. I added a little bit to it, and I wrote, if people think the activists of the 60s and 70s were fierce when they were young, they have no idea how fierce we can be as seniors, and Jerry loved it. We were not going to let that drop-in close, because we're the people that made all this happen. Amen. So someone said to Jerry and I, you two are so much alike. You're always yelling. And Jerry said, we have to yell because they don't listen. And he's exactly right. We had to yell because they don't listen. So Jerry came in the drop-in one day, into the drop-in room, and he told us about when he had been thrown out of, right here at the center, there is a room over at that end for gay youth. And so Jerry had been at the White House, met the Obamas, and this young man had been at the White House and met the Obamas. And so Jerry wanted to go and talk to him about his impressions, and he was thrown out of this room. So Jerry said, they threw me out, they think I'm a pedophile. So then we were all upset about that. There was another thing to add on. They think we're all pedophiles if we talk to young people. Far from it. So, anyway, Jerry and I would talk a lot on the phone, and we would Skype. And sometimes we'd have threesomes with Joy, Skype threesomes. That was not a threesome we had. And then Jerry would talk about different people and how much he cared about them. Jerry and I had great admiration and respect for each other. We shared many things about our lives with each other, and we trusted each other. We were kindred spirits. I'm also very independent, and don't ask people to help me with anything, and Jerry was just like that. So how we wound up being that close, I guess because we had that in common. And one other thing, what you see with us is what you get. No pretenses. We'll tell you to go fuck yourself, and that's it. We're not going to hide how we feel. Jerry was funny. He would say sometimes when we were leaving the drop-in, he'd say, "Oh, should I go to the supermarket or the sex store? Which should I do first?" But that's who Jerry was. And anyway, this June we were fighting again to keep the drop-in. And Jerry was getting sicker, and of course I needed more orthopedic surgery. We both had surgery in the fall of 2014, the late fall. And Jerry, I recovered pretty quickly from my surgery. Jerry was sick. We spoke on the phone quite a lot, and he didn't want visitors, then he'd want visitors. He called me one day and said, "Carol, you have to help me. They're trying to force me out of my apartment. Please help me." So he called this big old dyke many times to rescue him. And he told me he wasn't afraid of death, but he did hate the dying process. He hated being sick, he hated the pain. And I began to spend a lot of time with him. And he wanted me to talk. And I know he said the same thing to Christopher. "I don't care what you say, just talk. And I don't care what you talk about." And he always had CNN on the television, but no sound. Sometimes I would lie on his bed with him and we would talk. I could always get him to eat yogurt. At that time, it's about the only thing he would eat was yogurt. So I would make sure when I was there, he'd eat at least 2 yogurts. He was getting weaker and weaker. And sometimes we'd both fall asleep we would both fall asleep in his apartment. Me on the recliner and Jerry on his bed. Sometimes we were both on his bed taking a nap. I would speak to the nurses on the phone, and I made a chart for him to monitor the insulin levels and how many units to take. Sometimes he would forget to take his insulin, and I would tell him to make sure he took it. He promised not to tell anyone that he sometimes didn't take his insulin. I would stay with him for a good part of the day, and in the evening, his friend Peter Ross would come and spend the night with him. And he was back and forth between the hospice and his apartment. He called me from the hospice and told me that he had checked in, and I went to see him and, of course, brought him some yogurt. Sometimes he'd like to sit in the hall, so the aide and I would hold him up and walk him to a chair that I placed in the hall. He would sit there for a few minutes, and then he wanted to go back to bed. At the hospice, sometimes he wanted me to hold his hand, and sometimes he didn't. Sometimes he wanted to hold my hand. He also had CNN on there with no sound, and he wanted me to talk. He didn't care what topic, just talk, he'd say. And I know many of you will find this hard to believe, but sometimes I ran out of things to say. The Saturday evening before he died, he called me that he had been kidnapped and told me that he had been kidnapped and chained to a bed at the hospital. He also called Christopher Lennon and told Chris the same thing. And he wanted us to come and save him. And he loved Chris dearly. Christopher and I both declined to go. I went to see Jerry the next day, and the nurse told me that Jerry had called the police, and the police went to the hospital. Jerry said to me when I was there that Sunday, I said, "I can't believe you called the police." And he said, "Carol, you have to get me out of here. They kidnapped me. Look, I'm chained to the bed." And I told him, "Jerry, it's a catheter. You're not chained to the bed." And I picked up the catheter bag and I said, "Jerry, see? Yeah, well, they have me chained with the catheter." So I was with him a lot that week. And I posted this on Facebook. Like I said, I don't want to cry again because he's made me promise I wouldn't cry. I wrote, "My dear friend Jerry Hoose died today at 4:20. The doctor didn't come in till after 5 to do the official time of death. I am numb and aching, crying for my loss and for the community's loss. Angry that he died, angry that he suffered for the last 3 months, angry that I won't be able to talk to him anymore, glad that he did not die alone, and glad that I was with him. When I went to his room about 3 o'clock, I was shocked to see him in such a deteriorated condition. I had just spent many hours with him that week, and he was feisty, ornery, and barking. Today he could not lift his head up. I said, "Jer, it's Carol. Give me a kiss." I gave him a kiss, and told him that he looked spiffy. The nurses had washed his hair and put a clean gown on him. He opened his eyes, sort of smiled, and in a barely audible tone, he said, "Hi." As usual, he had CNN on TV, but the sound was off. I mean, the sound was on this time. That was unusual. The sound was on. And his arms were bent, with his elbows bent like this and his hands like this, almost like a fist. And I put his hands down, and I was holding his hand, and I sat next to him, and he gave me a squeeze, my hand, a very light squeeze. And the nurse came in and took his blood pressure and checked his respiration. His pressure was 50/30. She then called me into the hall. Hearing is the last thing to go, by the way, and told me to call his family and friends, that death was imminent. And she was going to call also. And I called, I went in the hall, picked up his phone, and called everybody I could think of. And I got no one, just voicemail. And Larry Guile I spoke to, the social worker at Sage. I went back into the room and I held his hand for another 10 minutes or so. And then he picked his head up and yelled, "No!" And then he put his head down. And maybe 10 minutes later, the PCA told me to look at his hands. They were getting very pale. We both checked for pulses in the neck and the wrist, and we had very, very faint pulses. I kept holding his hand, and I told him it would be okay to go, that I was there with him. I was kind of presumptuous of me, but I really didn't know what to say, except I knew how he was suffering. He died, and I sat there for a good 5-10 minutes, just holding his pale blue hand. The nails just started to turn blue, and the hand got really white, and just staring at him. I was stunned that it was that fast. Then I started crying. Eventually, the doctor came in and pronounced him dead. Tom Weber came from Sage, then Jerry's 2 brothers, Andy and Ricky, and then his sister-in-law, Beth, and finally his daughter, Brian. The PCA, the aide, said that he must have yelled "no" at death, and I knew that wasn't it, because on CNN, there was a story about a southern state that passed some anti-gay legislation. Jerry was an activist to the end. He sat up and went, he said, "Hi" and "no" that day. And the fight is not over. Jerry, myself, and other seniors have been fighting with Sage and the LGBT Center for almost 3 years to keep a senior presence at the center. Initially, Sage was reluctant to pay the rent. Then the center jacked up the rent for the senior drop-in, which has been here for 35 years, over 35 years. We have won the battles each year, but the fighting for funding goes on. Money to run the drop-in is less than 0.5% of Sage's budget. 0.5%. We now have the room for a few hours a day and not at all on Saturday. We used to have it much longer. Many items that were made by seniors have disappeared. Photos of deceased seniors are gone. Many items have not been returned to the drop-in because they are old and not aesthetically pleasing to some people at Sage and the center. Sage blames the center, and the center blames Sage. Both are responsible. Both treat us like children. They have utter disrespect for us, and we are the very people who made these places possible. Amen. One of the drop-in guys said, "We're old fags and old dykes, and they don't like us. They are just waiting for us to die." Jerry used to say that too. They're waiting for us to die. Jerry's death has energized me and other people and made us more committed to continue the fight. I refuse to be, as Jerry put it, living in the shadows, especially in our own community. The LGBT Center and Sage would not exist if many years ago we didn't come out of the shadows and expose ourselves. The Center and Sage are slapping us in the face with their indifference and, as Perry put it, ageism. The Center has assured us that they do want a senior presence at the Center. Sage has reluctantly agreed. Both organizations have become corporatized and have forgotten much of their history and their mission. We seniors at the Drop-In Center are feisty, and we will keep on fighting as long as we can, just as Jerry did. Yes. And there are so many people that are keep up that fight. And we'd like you to join us. As Jerry said, we have to yell because they won't listen. So yell with us in Jerry's memory. Thank you.